Hi everybody, this is Truth Seeker here, and today we're going to take a look at our next story in Genesis. In the last couple of weeks we looked at Genesis, the first and second chapters. This week we're going to take a look at the flood story, the flood myth. And if you do a little research, you'll see that the flood myth is something that is not unique to Christianity, to Judaism, but many cultures have a flood myth, and the reason for that is that most civilizations took place and grew around river systems, around coastal areas. That's where people that most readily traveled was by water. Early commerce from city to city in the ancient world. That's why many of the cities in our world today are located in coastal areas. And that's why with the rising oceans, we have so much concern, because places like New York City, Venice, New Orleans, all of the cities that are built within tidal regions are in jeopardy of going underwater as the ice caps melt and the oceans rise. And floods are not uncommon in many parts of the world. One of the earliest civilizations that began in Mesopotamia was built around the Tigris and Euphrates river systems. You had the Nile for Egypt, ancient Egypt. The Greeks were all built around, the Greek city-states were all built around the Mediterranean. And you had periodic flooding, you had exceptional flooding, exceptional weather events that would cause flooding. And so flood myths are not unusual for any culture, including North American, Native American cultures. So many of them have flood myths. And so this particular story of Noah and the ark made its way into Hebrew religious culture. And very likely because of their proximity to Mesopotamia, to Babylon, the fact that the Jews were held in captivity by Babylon for 70 years. They infused much of the culture and story background of Babylon into the Bible, because that was the period when much of the Old Testament was written, was during that 70-year captivity, to give the Hebrew peoples an identity around which they can form a cohesive culture, remain together. And when Babylon ceased to be, it was advantageous to them, and establishing a legitimacy for a homeland in terms of returning back to the Holy Land and to rebuilding Jerusalem and so on. So these stories were important to the Jews, regardless of the fact that they adopted them. Many of the elements of Genesis, of the Garden of Eden, of Noah, and the Great Flood were incorporated in very old Mesopotamian culture. The Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, has many of the same elements regarding the flood that you'll find in Genesis. It's interesting. There is an apocryphal book in the Old Testament called the Book of Enoch, and when the Dead Sea Scrolls and Quorum, I think it is Quorum, were discovered, they also found evidence of these books that didn't make it into the canon of the Old Testament, the Book of Enoch, and that is closely related to a book called the Book of Giants, and Gilgamesh, this Babylonian epic hero, is identified as one of the giants in these books, like the Book of Enoch. And people may pass off this idea that the Book of Enoch was just a mythological story, and that's why it didn't make it into the canon, except the New Testament writers, they took these books seriously. For example, Jude quotes directly from the Book of Enoch. And so you have these links that tie back to these ancient stories that have found their way into the Bible itself. And so it's quite interesting, but we really can't say that these are credible stories. They're myths that go way back, thousands of years, 4,000 or 5,000 years, into the religious cultures, the identity of the Babylonians and Mesopotamian peoples, and into the Hebrew culture, and the stories eventually made their way into the Bible. And so it is with Noah and the Great Flood story. And it's interesting. You can find this story in the 6th chapter of Genesis. Now, what's interesting about this is that there are, like in the New Testament, there are various sources. For example, the Gospels of, if you read any of those who have written books regarding, like Bart Ehrman or Robert Price, that talk about textual analysis and how you can determine that these Gospels were composites from different sources, that Mark may be the base source for the Gospels, but that there is a book called Quell, a manuscript called Quell, that was deduced by text that existed and made its way into the Gospels that could not be found in other Gospels. And so they can isolate through textual analysis the part of the texts in the Gospels that may have come from this other book they call Q. They shortened it to Q. Well, similarly, there's a similar concept that goes along with the Old Testament, that there are different sources that provide the text to the Old Testament. And there is what they call the Yahweh or Yahweh text, and then there's the priestly text, and they call that P. And these two different manuscripts or sources, I guess you might want to call them, made their way into Genesis. That's why you have two different accounts that are melded together in Genesis 1 on the creation of humans. You have two different stories, and they don't really complement one another. They, in some respects, they are similar, and then there's some significant differences between them. And the same thing happens here with the flood story, and so you end up with certain discrepancies in the flood story within the text itself. For example, in the Yahweh or Yahweh or whatever it is, I think let me get the proper name for it. Yeah, going back to my notes, I look at it's called the Yahwist text, and also the priestly text, and you have a J for the Yahwist. It's Jahwist, and priestly, and there are some significant differences between the two that were noted, and I believe the priestly text, there are annotations to the older text. I think what I have here, I could be wrong, but that the Yahwist text actually is older than the priestly, and that it's actually the one that more coincides with the Gilgamesh flood account. It's one of the key differences is the event, the storm event itself. Here, you have a week-long torrent. Let's see, a torrent rain that lasts 40 days and 40 nights, and then a week of recovery where the water drains. And then you have God's covenant. With the priestly account, you have God extolling Noah's virtues to distinguish why the world was destroyed, and Noah was the only virtuous man, and God decided to save his family. And then he made the covenant before the ark was constructed with Noah. And you have 2 of every animal and 7 of the clean, whereas the other account only has 7 animals. So, I mean, the clean animals have 7 pairs, whereas the unclean pairs only 1 pair. And then the other account, there is no reference to 7 pairs at all. It's only each species 2 by 2. And there is a difference in the length of the storm event. You have 150 days of the flood of the torrent, and then it takes a full year for it to recede. In one account, you have a raven that is used. In the other account, you have a dove that's used. And these accounts are kind of mashed together, but you can find the pieces that do originate from the Gilgamesh story of the flood, and then where the Jewish tradition interjected its flavor of Judaism into. That's where the priestly, because these were from the priesthood of the Hebrews, that edited these stories. And it took a full year for the water to recede off the earth from that story. And so there are significant differences that you can find between the two, and yet they're all kind of mashed together into one. And there are aspects of these that are related to the Epic of Gilgamesh through the Book of Giants and the Book of Enoch. So there you have quite a bit of the Babylonian and influence that is reflected there and made its way partly into the Old Testament, into the Torah. And so, starting with the sixth chapter, you had the angels who came down. Now, these angels were supposed to be helpers, according to the Book of Enoch and the Book of Giants. And after they got down here to the earth to help man in getting along in a righteous way, they saw the daughter of men, and they began taking them and interbred with them, and forming these giants. These giants were the offspring. And according to the Book of Enoch, I guess Gilgamesh is the name of one of the giants. So you actually have a direct reference of Gilgamesh in the Book of Enoch. Just to show you the closeness the two accounts, the two stories really have a common origin. And it got to the point where things were so wicked that God decided to destroy the world. Now, the Book of Enoch is, Enoch was a descendant of Adam, the seventh generation from Adam, according to Genesis. And he made this forecast, this prophecy that there would be, that the world that existed would be destroyed. Because of its great wickedness, and only Noah and a few would be selected to be saved. And in the story here, it's Noah and his three sons. The women aren't mentioned. It just says Noah and his wife and his sons and three wives, but they name Shem, Japheth, and Ham as the sons of Noah. You know what's interesting is that they make a point. 7 is a special number in the Bible, and 2 was the number that were chosen for the unclean. So a male and female for each species, and 7 pairs for each clean species. So what was man? Because there were 3 of Noah's sons, and who knows, I mean, Noah allegedly was 600 years old at the time of this flood. We didn't talk about ages, but there's no evidence that humans ever lived beyond what we see today. I mean, with today's medical knowledge, with our improved nutrition and hygiene and understanding of microbiology human life has been extended quite a bit. Before the present time, the present era, the last 100 years since Louis Pasteur, really, the the average age was something like 35. Human life was short, and it was often very painful, sickly. Infant mortality was very high. There were women were very likely to die in childbirth. It was not a very pleasant world to live in, and people succumbed to all sorts of problems. The plague and many other pestilences that spread across the world just made life the quality of life for human beings very low. If we had a time ever to choose to live, we are really very fortunate to live in the present age. Even 100 years ago, life was not nearly as comfortable as life is today, especially with respect to hygiene and medical advances. So there's no way in the world that we'd ever want to go back to the good old days. I don't understand the idea of that scientific progress is not very helpful to human beings, because it's made a huge difference in our life. So Noah was then, because God's intent to destroy the world, Noah was commissioned by God to make an ark to save himself and all the animals. He says, and God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all the flesh had corrupted its way upon the earth. And it actually says it not the May in the oh God, I can't think today. Male versus female had corrupted his way upon the earth. Women weren't valued very highly back at the time when the Bible was written. And God said to Noah, "The end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. And make thee an ark of gopher wood, and rooms shalt thou make in the ark. Rooms thou shalt make in the ark, and pitch it within and without with pitch." Now, I don't think whoever wrote this thing was very knowledgeable on shipbuilding. It's very scanty information here about the construction details of the ark. But this was a pre-Diluvian. This is, 4,000, 5,000 years ago. Noah was 600 years old, and it's been 4,000 years allegedly since the flood, if you take Bible chronology. So this is between 4,000 and 6,000 years ago, and they weren't really building ships at that point in time, and certainly not ships of any great size. There might have been small craft. Very likely there are indications that the very first inhabitants of the Americas may have actually come from Asia by following the coastline in small boats down through California and all the way down into South America. So it's possible. I mean, the earliest peoples in the Americas date back to about 13,500 years ago. So, there is evidence that small craft were being fashioned at that time, and in Asia. So why not Europe? I mean, it seems reasonable. But ships of any great size, the largest vessel ever built that was all wood was the Wyoming, which was built in 1909. It took that long in shipbuilding technology to be able to make a wooden ship of that size. Even the ships that the Greeks plied the Mediterranean in, the triremes, actually go back to Assyrian days with the biremes, the triremes, biremes. They were vessels. The triremes were vessels that were about 40 meters, so that's they're 3.28 feet per meter, so it's over 120 feet long. They could carry up to 200 people. Most of them were rowers. They would carry about 170 rowers. The rest of the crew were for fighting and for manning the rest of the vessel, for navigating and so on. And and that was pushing the limits of technology. And we're talking ancient Greece. We're talking 1200 BC, 1400 BC. So we're not talking any very, relatively speaking, very ancient period in humanity. I mean, we've got evidence that humans have been around for maybe up to 350,000 years, Homo sapiens. So that these vessels that the ancient Greeks used to conquer the Mediterranean world, they were cutting edge technology. In fact, if you read a little about the trireme, they used a rope to tension. The shipbuilding was very specific, and they had to be very careful about balancing things, the weight, the planking, and they used a special method for planking and ribbing. To lend strength so that there wasn't so much flexing. You couldn't make a ship too large out of wood because it would flex too much. And if it's in the wood absorbs the water. It warps the wood. The hull begins to do what they call hogging, which is an arcing like this, or sagging where it's like that, and that affects the ship's navigation dynamics, its hydrodynamics through the water, and that was one thing that they certainly couldn't compromise on, because these ships were their means for navigating long distances, traversing long distances. And I think a trireme could average 7 knots or so, which is 1.105 miles an hour per knot. So they're going 8 miles an hour on rowing, and they could get a little higher during the warfare when they rammed other ships. That's mainly how they did it, was through ramming. They had a metal post in the front that they'd ram a hole in other ships. but you see, the point I'm getting at is that we're talking about a much earlier period in Noah's day, and they're talking about a vessel that was allegedly built by Noah and three sons, four men, possibly with assistance from their wives, although somebody had to grow the food or whatever to eat. There are a lot of logistics issues with this story. Nobody had any experience of building a ship of this size ever, and until 1909. And so we'll get a little bit into some of the technical issues with the ship, but which I think makes for some amusing but thought-provoking ideas. But here it talks about pitching them. The ancient Greeks didn't use pitch. They actually, the way they constructed their ships, the wood actually swelled with water and became watertight. The seams would close up and make the ship watertight. So this idea of pitch to make it watertight is it's really not realistic. I mean, where are they going to get all that pitch from? The trees. You have to tap trees to get the pitch. It's the sap from from certain types of evergreens. We have a pine native here in the United States called the pitch pine, and they can distill it and make turpentine and such out of it. And they did make pitch out of it, which is a tarry material that's waterproof, and you could use it to waterproof seams in boats. But they didn't have that kind of technology back then. The ancient Greeks certainly didn't use any form of pitch or seal. I don't even think the Vikings used it. They had a different means of construction using overlapping planking, and I think they used like a wool in between for seams. I remember reading something about the construction techniques of the Viking vessels. But again, those vessels weren't really all that long either. I think the largest of the Viking warships would only carry 100, 150, a complement of 150 individuals. And again, they had to be careful about making them too large, because there were issues with the ship not being seaworthy after it's too large. And it says without and within, and so you pitch the entire inside of the Ark, and it's, if you ever looked at pine sap, it's pretty sticky stuff, and there's nothing that takes it off unless you have like turpentine, and I'm certain they didn't have distilling techniques back in Noah's day to make turpentine. Technologies back then were very, very crude. They were still basically in the Bronze Age, if that, Copper Age, and that was, not realistic to think that they were going to be able to mass produce that amount of pitch that they needed to seal the wood. Just think of all the planking they had to do. I just watched an interesting YouTube video on how to make planking and how to split the wood, and it's not easy. It's very laborious. In order to take a log and using wooden wedges to split along the grain in order to make a 2 or 3 inch plank in thickness. And so there are a lot of technical issues about the manufacturing end of it. And it would have been very uncomfortable to line it inside with pitch because that would have been just untenable. You couldn't really live in something like that. But anyway, it says to line it in and out with pitch to make rooms. Nobody knows exactly what gopher wood is. Some speculate that it's cedar, some pine. There are different conjectures as to what gopher wood was. But that whole region is really not very heavily forested. The Mediterranean region is relatively dry, and even the cedars of Lebanon, they have to protect them because there are really not that many in the mountains. They grow in a very special ecological system, and so you don't find that many. It's not that plentiful of wood, and we're talking here about a ship. Now they talked about the length of it. It says, and you will fashion it. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, the breadth 50 cubits, and the height 30 cubits. And it's thought that a cubit was 18 inches, so a foot and a half. Each cubit's about a foot and a half, so that would make the ark about 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. And now, if you want to compare that to the Wyoming, the largest wooden vessel ever made, I got some of the comparison dimensions. And these will kind of come into play a little later when we talk about the animals. There's no mention about framing or ribbing in the construction of the ark, which is essential to a ship's structure. In maintaining its integrity in the ocean, you have to have this frame. It's the skeleton of the ship. It's not just a matter of planking. You got to have it has to be able to hold form. You can't have twisting and torquing with a ship and bending, and especially if you think that we're talking about a rain event that occurred in a very short period of time. The only thing I can think of in recent years that might be what we would call a significant flood event was the Great Flood of 1993 that transpired along the Mississippi and Missouri rivers in between April and August of 1993, and I have some statistics on that. It really flooded quite a large area, but we're a little ahead of ourselves here. The Wyoming was the longest wooden vessel ever built, known to be built. It was constructed in 1909. It actually foundered in 1924, so it didn't really last all that long. And that was the problem with wooden vessels, too. Wooden seagoing vessels didn't last very long. They succumbed to the elements very quickly. Um, I don't think that the American clipper ships had much more of a life than 20 years. So wooden vessels were something that didn't have any longevity. I mean, the Queen Elizabeth and Queen Mary, the original ships, they were in service for what, 30, 40 years. They could have kept going, I guess, but technology had improved, and so it didn't make it economical for them. They were competing against air travel, but they could have continued using those vessels if they really needed to. In fact, I think the Queen Mary is still floating. It's a tourist attraction, I believe, in L.A. right now. I seen the Queen Mary when I was a kid. Both the Queen Elizabeth and the Queen Mary, the SS United States, and also the France, all along the New York waterfront on the Hudson River. They were all shipping piers. Cunard, White Star had gone out of business by then, but that was the Titanic. I think Cunard actually bought White Star or outcompeted them or whatever. But I do remember the Cunard lines. And I remember seeing the Queen Elizabeth and the Queen Mary on occasion, because we would take the West Side Highway to meeting every Sunday. We met in the 23rd Street Y on West 23rd Street, and we'd go past all of these big sailing vessels, and was on the QE2 once, just as a passenger, visiting passengers. My grandparents took the QE2 to Europe in 1971, so I was 16 years old, 16, and before they sailed off, they could have visitors on the ship, so I got to actually walk around on the QE2 and get an idea of what it was like to be on one of these grand old ships. And the QE2 is still, and well, I guess maybe Queen Mary 2 put it out of business. I'm not sure. I haven't looked lately, but if the QE2 is still operating, it was operating at least until recently. It may still be. I don't know. I have to look. But that would be, 50 years, 45 to 50 years now. But the Wyoming would have been roughly, if we have the idea of cubits correct, the Wyoming would have been about the size of the Ark. It was 450 feet long, had a beam or width of 50 feet, and had a draft of 30 feet. And a draft is how much water, when it's fully loaded, how much water it would need a channel, because the hull would descend below the surface of the water by 30 feet. So it had a draft. It had to be at least 30 feet high. Likely the deck was probably, the main deck was probably 15 to 20 feet above the water, so it might have had a deck that was 50 feet to the bottom of the vessel, or maybe more. So in certain aspects, even though it wasn't as wide, it slightly less wide. It was 50 feet in its beam. The Ark allegedly was 75 feet. So that's a difference of 25 feet, but the beam, or the draft, and the height of the Wyoming would have been higher than the Ark, which was 45 feet. And so volumetrically, the Wyoming would have been comparable to the Ark if we could take the dimensions correctly. I just did a quick estimate, given these dimensions, that it would have had a volume of 596,411 feet. And I used a calculation for the volume of an ellipse, sort of an elliptical. I don't believe it was a square vessel. It would have been likely rounded off at the ends. I don't know. I just think from the stability point of view, the ocean would have been tremendously turbulent. I mean, if you're talking about a weather event that is, it wouldn't be survivable. Come on, let's just, if you have a weather event where you have so much water that it destroys every living thing on the planet, and according to the account, covered every mountain on the planet, you would you'd need to have quite a violent event, which means you'd be talking about wave action. That there's no way that a vessel of this sort would have been stable enough to be able to withstand, especially with all the twisting and torquing that the wave action would have, the stresses that would have, it would have just turned into a bunch of splinters very, very quickly. Some individuals think it was comets, but if you had that many comets bombarding the Earth, they wouldn't just melt and rain. They would hit the Earth, and what is it? Tunguska, the event in the. One second, I gotta get the name right. I almost had it right. It's Tunguska event, the 1908 Tunguska event. They still don't know what that was, whether it was an asteroid that exploded 5 miles above the Siberian tundra. Well, it wasn't exactly tundra. There were forests there. Or if it was a comet. But nonetheless, if Noah's event was a bombardment of comets, which there would be evidence of, because comets leave debris, and a lot of debris behind them. That's what our Perseid and our Leonid meteor shower events are. These are all passing through the tails, the debris left from the tails of comets. There would have been a lot of debris left from a massive event that would have dropped so much water that there's no way that the Earth wouldn't be pockmarked like the Moon with meteor with craters from comets exploding and crashing into the Earth and with tremendous energy. I mean, Noah would not have survived such an event. And there is nothing that we could explain from a natural event point of view that would have allowed anybody to survive the kind of catastrophe that's described in the Genesis account. But then let's presume that something like that could happen. Interestingly enough, when we were talking about ship designs, this bowing, this what they call hogging and slumping, sagging. What the ancient Greeks did was they took a rope and doubled it, and they ran down the center line of the ship and tensioned it to give the whole structure a rigidity. It was like literally a bow, a bow and arrow. You want to have a certain amount of tension on that bow. You don't want a slack bow string you want to have a little bit of tension on that bowstring when you're shooting arrows. So there's some form structure there, and that was actually a technological secret. If anybody sneaked you want to talk about espionage, looking for military secrets, the rope that they used to tension their triremes in the ancient Greek world in Athens, that was considered treason if you sneaked one of these ropes out and to tell others about how their ships were constructed, because it was such an important facet of their ship building that it was a top secret feature of the triremes. And so you would have been held liable, and they didn't. Unlike our traders today, anybody who betrayed the Athens democracy was sentenced to death. So it was a serious thing, giving away military secrets like that. And so that I found kind of interesting. But one of the key things about a ship is that it's designed to carry stuff. And there are certain measures on these old vessels, in fact, even in vessels today, that are used. You hear of tonnage. And tonnage is actually a volume. It has something to do with the displacement of the ship, and what actually the capacity of the ship to be able to carry. So it's a volumetric thing, not actually a weight thing at all. Which is interesting, because you would think that when you're talking about a ship that's got a gross, what did they call that, GRT volume? It's a you would think that it's a gross tonnage or a weight for the ship, but it actually isn't. It's given in cubic feet. And the Wyoming had 373,000 cubic feet of gross tonnage. I just want to get that. I didn't write down. Fortunately, I didn't write down the. Where's the Wyoming? I didn't write down the Wyoming. Should be able to spell it. My grandfather homesteaded there back in the 1900s. Wyoming wooden vessel, and here we go. You can look it up. It's a six-masted schooner built in 1909, and it's gross register, GRT, gross register tonnage. And that's the ship's internal volume registered in tons, each of which is equal to 100 cubic feet. And it was replaced by, let's say, it replaced by gross tonnage. GRT uses the total permanently enclosed capacity of the vessel. And then there are other forms of measure. The one that's of interest is how much it can actually carry, how much weight it can carry, because that's really what a ship is for. Is mostly for freight and bringing commodities from one area of the world to another area of the world, and they call that the dead weight. How much a ship can carry. And the Wyoming had a dead weight tonnage or capacity of what they call 6,004 long tons. Now, a long ton is larger than a ton. A ton is 2,000 pounds. That's what we regularly use in the English system. I prefer the metric system because it's so much easier to do calculations. Especially for me at work, I deal with a lot of measurements in cubic meters and milligrams per liter and kilograms and so on. Much easier to do calculations using the metric system, but a ton is 2,000 pounds. And a long ton is 2,240 pounds. So the carrying capacity or the dead weight capacity or the dead weight tonnage of the Wyoming, which is comparable in size to at least volumetrically, to what the Ark would have been, is 6,720 tons. That's how much it could carry and safely sail over the ocean. And so we can assume that the Ark, at the very least, would have a similar deadweight tonnage or carrying capacity for it, which leads us to some very interesting things. I'm sure you're all interested in or knowledgeable of the fundamentalist group Answers in Genesis, and Ken Ham, and he built in Kentucky the Creation Museum as well as the Ark Encounter, and he's promoting the idea that the Ark is something that's feasible, right? And so I went to their webpage and I found some information. I didn't really take a lot of time there, but they claim that there were 7,000 animals. Now, what they do is they said that there are that there was a core group of what they call kinds. There's no scientific support for any of this. This is just something that they've made up, that they've kind of created. They say all the animal diversity that we see today came out of these kinds, and that it's the only way that they can get the Ark to carry all of the animals that existed on this vessel that's 450 feet long and 75 feet wide and 45 feet high. You got to think that it's got to be able to carry food for every animal for a year, and that there are 7,000 animals on this vessel. So that would be, if you paired them, then that's 3,500 pairs. And I did a little algebra to see, given the capacity, the tonnage, the fact that, I got some facts here. For example, you take a look at elephants. Two elephants are approximately 8 tons, 4 tons an elephant. An elephant will eat between 200 and 300 pounds of food per day. Okay, that is roughly 0.075 tons of food a day for each elephant. So for a year, let's see, I did the calculation. Okay, for 400, let's say 200 pounds of food a day for a year, roughly 73 tons a year. Okay, and if you use the higher end, 200 to 300 pounds a day, you have a range between 73 and 108 tons. And an elephant can eat up to 600 pounds a day, so that would bring it up even more. That would be again quite a bit higher. Now, carnivores, interestingly enough, and we must presume that there were carnivores on the Ark, will eat up to 50% of their body weight a day. They have a higher metabolism, and they have to consume quite a bit of meat. So that was a figure that I got off the internet. Ungulates eat. Ungulates is the group of animals like antelopes and deer and buffalo, cattle, rhinoceros, hippopotamus. All of those are ungulates. There are 270 different types of ungulates, 257 species of ungulates, and ungulates generally eat 2% of their body weight a day. And so you have to be able to carry that much food per ungulate. And I just used those numbers to do some estimating of how much food they would have to carry. Now, what's interesting, the volume of the ship limits the amount it can carry. Okay, so the quantity is limited to about 7,000 tons, or 14 million pounds of food. And if you had 7,000 animals, and 75%, I got this off of the internet, 75% of animals are herbivores, and 25% are carnivores. And so if you do a little bit of math, and if I can find my math, here we are. We can, you can see my sloppy calculations. If we had 7,000 animals on the Ark, 25% of them were carnivores and 75% of them herbivores. We do a little bit of algebra, and we come up with the limitation that we can only carry 14 million pounds, including the weight of the animals. Each animal would have to weigh 10 pounds. Now, if you go to the Ark Encounter and you look at their first page, you got an animal that's probably half again as high. It's a nondescript animal figure that's drawn on the front page of the Ark Encounter's advertising page. It's about half again as high as the person that's feeding it. There's no way that animal is 10 pounds. So we got some 5-year-old upstairs going on being a 5-year-old. But the reality of things is that there are 8.5 million species, not 7,000. And there are fewer species today. Many have gone extinct in the last 10,000 years. Many, many, many animals have become extinct over that period of time. But there is an estimate that there are 8.5 million species of animals. Now, if we take that and we divide up 75% of that into herbivores and 25% carnivores, and the fact that carnivores have a much greater dietary need, you do the math, you do the algebra, and the average weight of the animals would have to be no more than 0.138 ounces. Now, if you look at the northern shrew, the northern short-tailed shrew is 0.53 ounces, and the Eurasian shrew is 0.53 to 0.67 ounces. Now, 16 ounces makes a pound, okay, to give you the idea. And the interesting thing is that there's no way that you could even hold 8.5 million shrews on the Ark, because they have a dietary need of 200 to 300% of their body weight and nutritional needs, which means that you have to. We're talking, for the larger animals, we're talking about 2% of the body weight of an animal, a larger animal, like a giraffe. A giraffe may weigh a ton, maybe, and its dietary need is 2% of that. So a daily dietary need. A shrew's dietary need is 200 to 300%. There's no way you could carry enough food for animals that small, all these different species, these little miniature species. You're getting the point. There's just no way. And then we have the problem of species distribution. Why are there only marsupials? Marsupials are a specific type of mammal where there's no placenta. They're born within a couple of weeks of conception, and the embryo actually climbs into the pouch, and there's a series of nipples in the pouch, and it latches onto a nipple, and I believe there are different types of milk that are generated as the embryo goes through different stages into a joey, and you'll see, these illustrations of kangaroos with their joeys hanging out of the pouch, but until Western Europeans came to Australia, the animal life on Australia, the entire continent, was almost exclusively, I believe, pretty much exclusively marsupial. And they had diverged into many different species, carnivore and herbivore, to fit all the different ecological niches. And that's why you have a Tasmanian wolf and all these different animals that have placental analogs in other parts of the world. And so you have this conundrum, because why if the whole world had been inundated and all the animals destroyed except for what was on the ark, why would have the marsupials gone exclusively to Australia? And the other problem that you have is if there were 700 kinds, then you've had to have accelerated speciation to go from 7,000 to 8.5 million species today. And that is just unreasonable to think that anything like that could have ever occurred within documented history, because it would have had to happen during the time when humans had been able to document events. And then the most obvious issue that you have with the flood is, where did all the water come from? And where did it go? There are different theories as to where the water could have come from. It says in the account, when you go to Genesis, it says that it rained, and let's see, it says, I will bring the waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh from under heaven, and everything that is in the earth shall die, and everything of all flesh, two of every sort, you shall bring into the ark and keep them alive with thee, and they shall be male and female, and all the fowl and cattle, and everything after their kind, and creeping thing on the earth, and everything of their kind. And thou shalt, and let's see, and take unto thee all the food that is eaten, and all the food that gather. And we looked at some of the logistics problems with that, and they didn't even have a means of preserving this stuff. I mean, my gosh, we can reach into our refrigerator. I don't even want to take something that's been in the refrigerator after a week and eat it, so imagine trying to preserve something for a year on a boat. The other thing that people need to consider is, it rained and the fish should be okay. Well, the fish that have adapted into the oceans, you would have had such an influx of fresh water that would have been 2 to 3 times the volume of the ocean today, and we'll look at that calculation in a little bit. And it would have affected the salinity, that to the point where all the species that we have today would never have been able to survive because of the change in the salinity. They're specifically evolved into these niches. And there's such a diversity of life in the oceans that depend on a specific salinity content. And the oceans, I believe, are something like 30,000 parts per thousand of salt. You readily taste it when you go to the ocean. And then there's a very small part of the water on the earth that's fresh water, like in the Great Lakes. So Great Lakes actually hold only 20%, or not only, 20% of all the fresh water in the world, which means the 80% of the fresh water, which is less than 3% of all the water on the planet. I think 95% of the water on the planet is in the oceans, locked in the oceans. And then you have some in the atmosphere. You have last week I showed the water balance. This week I think I'll try and bring up the way water is broken out on the planet. Yes, I did have the image. I got this from the USGS website. You can see 96%, over 96%, 96.5% of all the water on the earth is locked up in the oceans. And remember, the Earth is 71% covered with ocean. And I think the average depth of the ocean is about 12,500 feet, or 2.3 miles. So this is all salt water. It's roughly 30,000 parts per thousand salt. There are saltier bodies of water we call brine, like the Dead Sea, the Aral Sea. There are, at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico, there are brine pools whose density is so distinct that they form basically separate bodies of water at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico. And you can see here on that green bar, the very top, 2.5% of all the water on the planet is fresh water. And then they have a line that breaks out the fresh water into its different components. Surface water is 1.2% of that 2.5%. Groundwater is 30% of that 2.5%, and the rest is locked up. The rest of fresh water is locked up in glaciers, ice caps, mostly in Antarctica and in Greenland, and that's the ice. That climate change is. Scientists are worried about that melting and raising the ocean levels up another 150 feet. Since the last ice age, the oceans have risen over 400 feet. And one of the reasons we know that is that there's a cave in France that's 400 feet below the surface of the Mediterranean in a cave where there are 30,000-year-old cave drawings from the Ice Age by prehistoric men. And so you know that the ocean level was below that point. They didn't hold their breaths and swim down to the cave so they could draw in it. They wouldn't have been able to create a fire to bring light in. So that water rose after men had been able to walk into that cave. And the ocean, or the landlocked water, has enough capacity to raise the ocean another 100 or more feet. And then the surface water is broken out into ice, permafrost in the ground up in the polar regions, and lakes. Like I said, the Great Lakes carry 20% of all the fresh surface water on the Earth. And then you have a large amount trapped in the atmosphere. One of the little facts that most people don't realize is that the most prevalent greenhouse gas on the planet is evaporated water, is steam, basically. The clouds and the water that's evaporated into the air. And that traps. If you ever notice on a cloudy night, especially in the wintertime, you'll notice that it's never as cold on a cloudy night as it is during a clear night, because the radiation bounces off the bottom of the cloud and traps it. So here we have the breakout. Now, if the volume of water needed to cover the Earth, let's see, Mount Everest is 29,000 feet above our current sea level, 29,000 some odd feet. I had the calculation. Taking a look at that. I have all my calculations mixed up here. Here we go. Yeah, the volume of water, let's see, would have to be 2.3. Let's see, the average depth of the ocean is 2.3 miles. And to have enough water to cover Mount Everest, we'd have to add another layer of water that is 29,000 additional feet. Now that's over 5 miles of water. So that's twice the depth of the average depth of the ocean as it is. So that's a tremendous amount of water, and that's water over all the Earth. The 2.3 miles of water covers only 70% of the Earth. Nearly 30% of the Earth, or 29% of the Earth, is land. And so when you're talking about this additional water, you're talking about over the entire surface area of the Earth, an additional 5 miles. So that just think of that. That's doubling, more than doubling the volume of the water that's already on the Earth. And I did these calculations that estimate how much water there would be needed to cover Mount Everest, and you're diluting the salt content of the Earth by a huge amount. Now, if all that water had been salt water that in the deluge, then where's all the salt deposits? Where did that water go? Where did all that water go? We have twice the depth of the average depth of the current oceans that cover the Earth to be able to cover the highest mountains. In this case, it's Mount Everest, which is 29,000. Something like 29,060 feet, 29,032 feet, or 2.4 times the current depth of the ocean today. So that's where my information is. Where did it come from? Where did it go? And why didn't all the sea life die? Whales and such. You know, people think so simplistically, oh, it's only water, the fish would have lived. It would have been turbulent. It would have been muddy. There would have been silt all over the place. The magnitude of the waves from the event that would have caused all that volume of water to come onto the Earth would have crushed that tiny little ark. There just is no way that this story could have ever held. I did the additional calculations you can see here. I got the Earth, and I did the. You can see I have a double shell. It represents the additional depth of the water that would have had to cover the surface of the Earth, and it would have meant an additional volume of 1.6 by 10 to the 20 cubic feet of water, or 1.1 billion cubic miles of additional water. That's a lot of water. Where did it go to? You know, I mean, you could think that, oh, it went down into the depths of the Earth. But you got a problem with that, because the Earth, the Earth is porous. You know, rain will fall onto the ground and infiltrate the pores. They call that porosity in the soil. But the porosity of soil is 1 to 40%. 40% is awfully high. That would be something like sand or gravel, where there are large pore volumes between the rocks. For the most part, soil is pretty tight, and it would be more in the 1% range. So you would need to have that water infiltrate the Earth by 188 miles. Now, if there was that much water under the earth, we would know it. The seismologists are able to take um, size size seismic readings of the earth. Whenever an earthquake goes, they're able to discern the construction of the earth by how the pressure waves, that's what's represented here. Whoops, right there. The waves, the pressure waves, which traverse through the earth, they refract when they hit different densities. So the core is made of nickel iron, not melted or plastic silicon dioxide like the mantle. The mantle is more of a rocky material. The core is liquid iron nickel composition, and the when the wave hits that core, it bends just like when you look at on a clear pond. Let's say there's no ripples on the pond, and you look at something under the water. That object isn't exactly where you think it is because your line of sight, the light is bent once it hits the light hits and comes through the surface of the water. It bends. That's called refraction, and so it makes the object look a little bit displaced from where it's actually located. If it were in the air, you would be able to see it and reach and touch it, but under the water you're reaching in a different spot from where the object actually is if you want to pick it up. Because of the refraction of light, it makes it look like it's in a different spot. The same thing happens with the compression or sound waves of seismic waves through the earth. And so if there was water there, the wave passes at a different speed of water saturated rock than it does through the unsaturated rock. And so they know the composition of the earth, how it's layered, how it's structured, using seismic studies. Geophysicists know this information, and they know what the structure of the earth is, and they're pretty accurate with it. And there's no indication at all that any of this alleged water had made its way down under the earth, thrown, infiltrated back. I've seen people try to explain that, but they don't understand anything about geophysics. And so that's problematic, and it's not scientifically supported. So we would know these things. So there never was a time where there was that much water on the earth. It just isn't possible. So we've looked at a lot of different things here with Noah. It's a fun story. Kids love it. It involves animals. I remember in New York City in Central Park, there was Noah's Ark in the Central Park Zoo, where you had a petting zoo where you could go onto Noah's Ark and pet the animals. But it's not realistic. It's a children's story. And the whole idea that this deluge came upon the earth and destroyed all of humanity and all of life, and this little group making it through. There's no way that they could have done that. I mean, what happened to the Wyoming? The Wyoming found it wasn't seaworthy. It was just too big for a wooden vessel. It twisted. It turned. It torqued. It slumped in rough seas. They had the pumps going all the time. They had a steam pump on it. It was a sailing vessel. It could these windjammers, they called them. They operated until the 1920s and 30s. Most of them were cast iron. You can still see specimens of these windjammers, like in the South Street Seaport in New York City. They're iron hulled, but the wooden Wyoming didn't last. It foundered because it was constantly leaking all the time. The steam pumps had to operate all the time because the twisting caused it to leak. It wasn't watertight. It just couldn't remain seaworthy. And so these are some of the technical problems, and there's no indication in Genesis that God had given Noah some special design that would make a wooden vessel, a superior wooden vessel, to withstand the types of turbulence that they would have encountered in a tremendous event. I just wanted to compare this flood event to something far less substantial. Back in 1993, the Midwest experienced a 500-year flood event of the Missouri and the Mississippi rivers. And in fact, the rivers went to an all-time high. I think in many towns there were floods that had never been measured to that extent ever. And I took a couple of notes. It took. Let's see, sagging, hogging, 21 here. Oh, we're talking about the Gulf Stream. I was thinking about, if it was floating around the ocean for a year, there would have been currents. The Gulf Stream is one of the fastest currents. It's about 5.6 miles an hour. If it were out in the ocean for a year, the Ark would have traveled 48,000 miles if it got caught in the Gulf Stream gyre, I think it's pronounced, Gyre, gyre. The Pacific has a gyre. It's not quite as fast. I think it's about 2.5 miles an hour. But then still, the Ark would have traveled 21,000 miles at that speed, 7 kilometers an hour. Okay, here I got my little statistics on the 93 flood. The Missouri and there was exceptional snow. There was exceptional rain between April and August 31st. April 1st and August 31st, there were 48 inches of rain in that watershed. Normally, they don't even get that amount in a year, and they had a particularly heavy snowpack that previous winter, which melted and saturated the ground and added additional water to the already swollen rivers from the melt, and then the exceptional rains that took place during that summer caused the river in places like it flooded 75 towns. It covered and flooded something like 75,000 square miles. Here I got 20 million acres, 50,000 homes destroyed. It impacted 9 states, 54,000 were evacuated, and it took 200 days for this flood, which was 20 feet above flood stage, It didn't cover the Rocky Mountains. It didn't cover the Appalachian Mountains, and it took 200 days to drain. So this idea of draining 5.5 miles of water covering the earth to the present sea level in a year's time is it's just not realistic, and it just makes the whole thing. I just wanted to present a real life flooding situation, and I think maybe if this event occurred 2,000, 3,000, 7,000 years ago, and all there were Native Americans, and to the few Native Americans that may have lived in that particular region of Missouri and the central North America experienced a flood like that, they would have a flood myth. It would have destroyed everything that they've known. It would have covered everything because of the plains, the hills that they're familiar with. It would have been nothing but water for. Here it says 400,000 square miles were covered, and it took 200 days to drain. And so, there would have certainly been a Native American myth, flood myth, that would have described that. And the fact that the Epic of Gilgamesh has a flood story, and the fact that the Euphrates and the Tigris and that civilization began in that area, they're flood myths. And who knows how they would have been exaggerated, but it's understandable that something like that could have derived from maybe some ancient experience that became mythicized as the story was told before writing orally. So, it's possible that's where it derived. But there's strong evidence that the story, we think of it as part of a Christian heritage or Judeo-Christian heritage. It really originated from Mesopotamia, and there are very, very strong indications, good indications, logical indications that suggest that this myth originated with the ancient Mesopotamians. And during the captivity, many of the stories of origin stories, the Garden of Eden, the Epic of Gilgamesh, became intertwined with the Hebrew narrative, and the influence of the priesthood editing and amending the story and making it so that it was more in line with their idea of God. And so I can see that happening. And but there's so many questions that you just can't take it literally, and yet I can't even. I guess this Ken Ham really believes what he's promoting. I guess you can delude yourself, but he's also making money on it. I don't know what the entrance fee is, but I think it's one of those kinds of rides, like if you go to Disney World and you go to the Family Swiss Robinson Treehouse. My God, what the hell is there? I mean, I want to see the dinosaur munching. I want to see the crocodile on the Jungle Cruise. I want to see the pirates fighting. I don't want to climb a treehouse. And that's kind of what this Ark experience is, as far as I know. I've seen a few of these videos, and they have these they have these dioramas where you have somebody fighting some kind of a dinosaurish looking thing in and some arena. I mean, it's total fantasy. And they have air conditioning. I don't know how Noah would have ventilated that ship with a 1 meter window. That's the only thing. And the smell that would have existed with all those animals, it would have been worse than the sanitary conditions would have been awful. And yet, he tries to address all of these logistical problems with this Ark Encounter, with a how can 8 people operate a vessel of this sort with all of these many animals and keep the food fresh and preserved and make it edible for a year, and it just doesn't address the problem that Ark Encounter has, is that the wood itself is in the first year of its construction began showing a tremendous staining on it because it wasn't preserved well. The Kentucky environment was just too much for the wood. The South wreaks havoc on wood structures. We don't. That's why many of the homes down in the South were built stucco or cinder block. Wooden structures didn't last long because of all of the little critters down there that like the subtropical climate that eat wood. So anyway, I think this has gone on long enough, and I hope you enjoyed it. Give you a little something to think about in terms of the Bible, and the idea that the Bible can be taken literally, and it's. And what is the moral behind killing everybody on Earth? And there's no. Another question is, if the human race, the whole point of the flood was to maintain the purity of the human race, and that Noah was. Noah and his family were genetically pure from Adam, then how did the Neanderthal genetics get into European and Asian genes, the European and Asian genome, and not in the African genome? And we know when Neanderthals lived, they predated Homo sapiens. They were parallel hominid, and yet we have these genetics up to 2-3% in our genes, and none in African genes, and how did that happen? If the human race had been reduced to 8 people of pure Adamic stock, it must have been that Adam was part Neanderthal then, which then denies the idea that Adam would have been a creation of God. So there are so many discrepancies, and it's not a conspiracy of science. It's not a conspiracy of science. I think it's fascinating that we've got this aspect in our genome. So again, I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope I gave you a few things to think about, and I wish you well for the remainder of this weekend. And I wish you the best.